Golden child brother sabotaged my career. Parents helped him cover it up, then they asked put it all behind them. But what I did next? I'm Jason, 29 years old. If you told me 10 years ago where I'd be today, I wouldn't have believed you. A kid from a modest background making it big in finance? It sounded more like a dream than a possibility. But here I am, living in Philadelphia, working for one of the most reputable firms in the industry. In just 6 years, I've built a reputation that others spend decades trying to achieve. It hasn't been easy. Late nights, endless pressure, and constant scrutiny come with the territory, but for me, it's always been worth it. Every deal closed, every milestone reached, it's all fueled by something deep inside me. A hunger to prove myself, to prove to my family, and maybe even to myself, that I'm more than what they thought of me growing up. Growing up, my family was tight-knit in the way that a dysfunctional team might be, tied together by necessity, not love. My parents, Richard and Linda, never treated my brother Eric and me the same. Eric, 5 years older than me, was their golden child. No matter what he did, they found a way to excuse it. Bad grades? It was the teacher's fault. Skipping class? He was too smart to sit through boring lectures, and when he did the bare minimum, they'd throw a parade for him. For me, it was the opposite. I worked my tail off to get straight A's, but all I heard was, "Don't get cocky," or "You're only as good as your last report card." If I made a mistake, they pounced on it. I'd get lectures about responsibility, how I needed to set an example for Eric, and how I had to work harder if I wanted to achieve anything in life. That double standard burned itself into me, shaping how I saw the world. I've always been competitive, but not in the way Eric is. He competes by pulling others down, while I've always believed in lifting myself up. Maybe that's why I found so much success early in my career. The rejection and indifference I faced at home hardened me, made me more focused, but it also made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Things came to a head last Thanksgiving. I just finished a grueling quarter at work and was looking forward to relaxing, even if it meant dealing with my family. Eric was there, of course, sipping beer on the couch while my parents fawned over him. At some point during dinner, he turned to me with this smug grin and said, "So, Jason, how's the corporate grind? Still crunching numbers and draining souls?" The table erupted in laughter. Even my parents chuckled. I forced a laugh, brushing it off like it didn't sting. But it did. It wasn't just the jab. It was the way everyone joined in, like it was perfectly fine to mock what I'd worked so hard for. After dinner, Eric cornered me in the kitchen. "Hear about the layoffs at your firm?" he asked, almost too casually. "You worried?" I wasn't. My role was secure, or so I thought at the time. I gave him a quick response and moved on, but something about the way he asked lingered. How did he know about the layoffs? It wasn't public knowledge, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone in the family. In the following weeks, things at work started to feel off. Emails I'd sent seemed to vanish into thin air. Meetings I was supposed to attend were rescheduled without my knowledge. My colleagues started treating me differently, polite but distant, like they knew something I didn't. At first, I chalked it up to office politics. Every workplace has its quirks, and finance is notorious for cutthroat competition. But then it got worse. I'd been eyeing a promotion for months. My boss, Michelle, had hinted that I was the top contender. I'd gone above and beyond to prove myself, taking on extra projects and even mentoring new hires. Then, out of nowhere, the promotion went to someone else. When I asked Michelle for feedback, she avoided my gaze. "There were concerns about your professionalism," she said. "Specifically, a rumor that you'd been speaking negatively about colleagues to clients." I was stunned. I'd never badmouthed anyone, let alone to a client. When I pressed her for details, she shook her head. "The decision's been made. Let's focus on moving forward." Moving forward? How was I supposed to do that when my reputation had been dragged through the mud? The paranoia set in after that. These weren't random coincidences. Someone was targeting me, but I couldn't figure out who or why. I started double-checking everything: emails, meetings, even casual conversations. But the harder I looked for answers, the more elusive they became. Eric's weird comment at Thanksgiving kept replaying in my mind. It felt absurd to think he had anything to do with my work troubles. How could he? He didn't know the first thing about my industry. Yet, every time I saw him, he dropped little remarks about my job, specific details he shouldn't have known. At Christmas, he mentioned a new client my firm had just signed in the tech sector. I'd only learned about it the day before in a private meeting. When I asked how he knew, he just smirked. "Read it online," he said. Meanwhile, Eric's life seemed to take a sharp turn for the better. He started showing up in designer clothes, talking about an upcoming vacation to Greece. This was a guy who couldn't keep a job for more than 6 months. Where was the money coming from? "Looks like someone hit the jackpot," I joked during one family dinner. Eric's face darkened. "I've been saving," he snapped, his tone defensive. "Not that it's any of your business." My parents, of course, rushed to his side. "He's finally getting his life together," my mom said, beaming. "You should be happy for him." Happy? I didn't know what I felt. Uneasy, maybe. Suspicious. But mostly, I felt like an outsider again, watching a play where everyone knew their roles except me. The final straw came one quiet evening at home. I was sorting through my emails when I found one in my junk folder. It looked like spam at first, poorly written, full of vague phrases about mutual benefits and confidential operations, but one line stopped me cold. "Your brother's agreement with our firm has been most beneficial." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It didn't make sense, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was personal, and somehow, Eric was at the center of it. That night, I realized I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Someone was trying to destroy everything I'd worked for, and if I didn't act soon, they'd succeed. I had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. The night I found that email, I barely slept. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and doubt. Could Eric really be involved in this? If so, why? What did he stand to gain by sabotaging me? And even more unsettling, was he acting alone? The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I started by combing through every email, document, and message I'd saved on my work laptop. Most of it was routine, client updates, internal memos, meeting notes, but a few things stood out. There were emails I didn't remember sending, phrased in ways I'd never write. One, in particular, caught my attention. It was addressed to a client and included a line about frustrations with unprofessional colleagues. That wasn't me. I printed it out, along with anything else that looked suspicious, and stashed the papers in a drawer. If someone was impersonating me, I needed evidence to clear my name. But even as I tried to focus on work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I needed weren't in my office. They were at home, or rather, with my family. The following weekend, I visited my parents under the pretense of helping them with their slow computer. I wasn't planning to snoop. I just wanted to see if anything seemed off. My parents had always been terrible with technology, so I figured they wouldn't notice if I poked around a bit. As I scrolled through their laptop, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. A shared bank statement left open in a browser tab. I wasn't trying to be nosy, but the details jumped out at me. There were regular transfers labeled Support Fund, going directly to Eric's account. The amounts weren't small, thousands of dollars each month. "Hey, what's this?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. My dad glanced over from the kitchen, where he was making tea. "Oh, just some help for your brother," he said, shrugging. "You know he's been struggling. We're just giving him a little boost." A little boost? That boost was more than I made in a month when I first started my career. "Must be nice," I muttered, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. My mom gave me one of her patented disapproving looks. "Don't start, Jason. He's had a tough time, and we're just trying to level the playing field." Level the playing field. That phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. For as long as I could remember, my parents had treated Eric's shortcomings as obstacles to overcome while dismissing my successes as luck or arrogance. Now, they were literally paying him to catch up to me. I left their house that day more convinced than ever that Eric was involved in the chaos at work. The timing of those payments was too perfect to ignore. They'd started just a few months before the first signs of trouble at my job, but I needed proof. The next morning, I called a private investigator. It felt extreme, even paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. If Eric was behind this, I needed more than just suspicions to confront him, or to protect myself. The PI worked fast. Within a week, they uncovered something that left me speechless. Eric had been sending emails to one of my company's competitors, sharing detailed information about our projects and clients. But that wasn't the worst part. He'd written the emails as if they were from me. I couldn't believe it. My own brother had gone out of his way to sabotage me, framing me as the source of the leaks. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Eric directly. I showed up at his apartment unannounced, my heart pounding as I knocked on the door. He answered in sweatpants and a designer hoodie, holding a glass of wine like he didn't have a care in the world. "Jason," he said, flashing that smug grin I'd grown to hate. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping past him into the living room without waiting for an invitation. He followed me, still grinning. "What's up? You look tense." I took a deep breath and pulled out the printed emails. "Care to explain these?" His grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" "You've been sending confidential information to a competitor," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And you've been pretending to be me while doing it. Don't even try to deny it. I have proof." Eric laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my blood boil. "You've lost it," he said. "Seriously, Jason, you're working too hard. Maybe take a vacation or something. Don't play games with me," I snapped. "I know what you've been doing, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." His expression shifted then. The smugness melted away, replaced by something darker. "You always think you're better than me," he said quietly, setting his glass down. "Always the golden boy, always ahead. Maybe I just wanted to show you what it feels like to lose for once." I stared at him, stunned. I'd expected denial, excuses, anything but this. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "You're still standing, aren't you? What's the big deal?" The rage bubbling inside me threatened to boil over, but I held it back. "This isn't over," I said, turning to leave. "Oh, I think it is," he called after me. But he was wrong. That night, I decided to confront my parents next. They had to know something. They'd been funneling money to Eric for months. After all, when I brought up the bank transfers during a family dinner, they immediately got defensive. "We're just helping him get back on his feet," my mom said. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "And what about the emails he's been sending?" I asked, slamming the printed papers onto the table. "You're telling me you had no idea he was sabotaging me at work?" My dad frowned, his jaw tightening. "Eric wouldn't do something like that," he said firmly. "Then explain this," I said, pointing to the documents. For a moment, the room was silent. My parents exchanged a look, and I knew they were hiding something. "You're imagining things," my mom finally said. "You've been under a lot of stress lately, Jason. Maybe you should take some time off." Their dismissal felt like a slap in the face. They weren't just ignoring the evidence. They were defending Eric. I left their house feeling more alone than ever. But if they thought I was going to back down, they didn't know me at all. After the disastrous confrontation with Eric and the futile attempt to reason with my parents, I knew there was no turning back. The family dynamic I'd spent my whole life navigating had officially crumbled, and all I had left was my determination to uncover the full truth. The private investigator's findings gave me the foundation I needed to start piecing everything together. Eric hadn't just been sending emails to a competitor. He'd been impersonating me to do it. And my parents, despite their insistence otherwise, were directly funding his lifestyle. What I didn't know yet was how deep this conspiracy went or how far they were willing to go to see it through. That week at work, the situation took another turn for the worse. My boss, Michelle, called me into her office for yet another serious conversation. "We've had another complaint," she said, looking uncomfortable. "What now?" I asked, barely able to mask my frustration. "This time, it's about a leak," she said. "Someone's accused you of sharing sensitive information with a competitor." My stomach dropped. It was exactly what Eric had been doing, only now, the blame was landing squarely on me. "I didn't do it," I said firmly. "I don't know who's spreading these lies, but I can prove I'm not the one behind this." Michelle gave me a long, searching look. "Jason, I believe you," she said finally, "but these accusations are serious. If we can't get to the bottom of this, Your position here could be at risk. That was the moment I realized I couldn't just play defense anymore. Whoever was targeting me, Eric, my parents, or all of them, wasn't going to stop until they'd ruined me completely. I needed to take the fight to them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A few days after the meeting with Michelle, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Samantha, Eric's ex-girlfriend. Her message was simple. I think I have information that might help you. Can we talk? I was skeptical at first. Samantha and Eric had broken up years ago, and as far as I knew, they hadn't spoken since. But something about the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near her apartment. When I arrived, Samantha was already waiting at a corner table. She looked nervous, fiddling with her phone as I approached. "Thanks for coming," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for reaching out," I replied. "What's this about?" She took a deep breath and launched into her story. Apparently, during the time she and Eric were dating, he'd been open about his frustrations with me. He'd complained constantly about living in my shadow, about how our parents had always held him to a different standard while expecting me to succeed. He always felt like he had something to prove, she said, sipping her coffee. But I didn't realize how far he was willing to go until recently. Samantha explained that a mutual friend of theirs had mentioned Eric bragging about finally taking Jason down a notch. At first, she thought it was just talk, but then she started going through her old messages and found something alarming. Screenshots of texts between Eric and my parents, discussing ways to undermine me at work. "I don't know all the details," she said, handing me her phone, "but it sounds like your parents were more involved than you think." The screenshots were damning. In one, my dad suggested timing Eric's leaks to coincide with major projects at my company, knowing it would cause the most damage. In another, my mom expressed concern that I might figure out what was happening and urged Eric to be more careful. Seeing those messages hit me like a freight train. It was one thing to suspect Eric of sabotaging me. It was another to see my parents actively plotting against me. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, struggling to process what I just read. Samantha shrugged. "Eric hurt a lot of people, including me. I guess I just wanted to do the right thing for once." With Samantha's help, I finally had the evidence I needed to confront my parents again. This time, I wasn't going to let them brush me off. The opportunity came during a visit to their house. I arrived unannounced, catching them off guard. My mom was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, while my dad was in the living room watching TV. "We need to talk," I said, setting my bag down on the counter. My mom sighed. "Jason, if this is about Eric again..." "It is," I interrupted, pulling out the screenshots. "And this time I have proof." I handed the papers to my dad, who frowned as he skimmed through them. My mom glanced over his shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to panic. "Where did you get these?" she demanded. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been lying to me. You've been funding Eric's sabotage and helping him ruin my career." My dad set the papers down and folded his arms. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice defensive. "Oh, really? Then what is it?" I shot back. My mom started to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't even try to justify this," I said. "You've been working against me for months, maybe years. And for what? To make Eric feel better about himself?" "Jason, calm down," my dad said. "We were just trying to help your brother. He's had a hard time and what?" I demanded. "You thought destroying my life was the best way to fix his?" My mom's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," she said. "We just wanted to level the playing field." There it was again. That phrase. "You've been saying that my whole life," I said, my voice shaking. "But this isn't about fairness. It's about enabling Eric at my expense. I'm done being the scapegoat for this family." Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my bag and walked out the door. That night, I sent everything I had, the screenshots, the emails, the PI's report, to my lawyer. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The fallout started almost immediately. My parents called me the next day, begging me to reconsider. They claimed they'd only acted out of love, that they'd never intended to hurt me. But their excuses fell flat. I hung up on them and blocked their numbers. As for Eric, he sent me a series of messages ranging from sarcastic jabs to outright threats. "You think you're so perfect," one read, "but you're just as screwed up as the rest of us." Another simply said, "Watch your back." It was clear that things were only going to get worse before they got better. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to stop until I had justice. After my confrontation with my parents, things started unraveling quickly. They had always been the rock of my family, or so I'd thought. But now their actions were catching up with them. While I focused on gathering evidence and protecting myself, their carefully constructed facade of a supportive, respectable family began to crumble. It started with work. Armed with the evidence I'd collected, emails, screenshots, and the investigator's report, I scheduled a meeting with Michelle, my boss. This time, I wasn't going to hold back. When I sat down in her office, I laid everything out in front of her. The emails Eric had sent pretending to be me, the proof of his communications with our competitor, and even evidence tying my parents to his scheme. As I explained each piece, Michelle's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "This is incredible," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Jason, why didn't you come forward with this sooner?" "I didn't know how deep it went until recently," I admitted. "I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, but now that I have it, I need to clear my name." Michelle nodded, picking up one of the printouts. "This changes everything," she said. "We'll launch an internal investigation immediately. In the meantime, I'll make sure these accusations against you are dismissed." For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but at least I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Word spread quickly within the company. The same colleagues who had been keeping their distance suddenly started reaching out, apologizing for believing the rumors. One even confessed that they'd overheard whispers about Eric's involvement, but hadn't known how to bring it up. People were scared, they said. No one wanted to get caught in the crossfire. But now that we know the truth, we're behind you. Their support meant more to me than I could express, but it also fueled my resolve to see this through to the end. While things were starting to improve at work, the situation with my family was spiraling out of control. One evening, I received a call from a distant relative, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Jason, I don't know how to say this," she began hesitantly, "but there's a lot of talk going around the family about you and your parents." "Talk?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Apparently, your parents have been telling people that you're overreacting, that you're trying to tear the family apart for no reason," she said. "They're playing the victim, saying they only wanted to help Eric and you've blown it out of proportion." I felt my blood boil. Of course, they were trying to spin the narrative in their favor. It was classic Richard and Linda: deflect, deny, and make themselves the victims. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, "but I'm done worrying about what they think. The truth will come out soon enough." It didn't take long for that truth to start making waves. The investigator uncovered more evidence that not only implicated Eric, but also exposed my parents' broader financial mismanagement. They hadn't just been funneling money to Eric. They'd been dipping into a shared inheritance account for years, using the funds for personal expenses and to cover up their involvement in Eric's sabotage. The findings were enough to warrant legal action. With my lawyer's help, I filed a lawsuit against Eric for defamation and began proceedings to recover the misused funds from my parents. It wasn't just about the money. It was about holding them accountable for what they'd done. The backlash from my parents was immediate. They called me, begging me to drop the lawsuit. "We're family," my mom said, her voice trembling. "You can't do this to us. You should have thought about that before you tried to ruin my life," I replied coldly. My dad tried a different approach, threatening to cut me out of their will if I didn't back down. I almost laughed. "You've already stolen from me," I said. "What's left to lose?" As the legal battle unfolded, their reputation in the community took a nosedive. Word about the financial mismanagement and sabotage started circulating among their social circle, thanks in part to a small news outlet that picked up on the story. My parents went from being well-respected pillars of the community to social pariahs. My dad resigned from his position on the neighborhood association board, and my mom stopped attending her weekly book club. They retreated into their home, isolating themselves from the world they'd once been so proud to be part of. Meanwhile, Eric's life was falling apart in its own way. The company he worked for caught wind of his actions and launched their own investigation. It didn't take long for them to uncover evidence that he'd been using company resources to assist in his scheme against me. He was fired on the spot, leaving him without a steady income or any way to maintain the lifestyle he'd been flaunting. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling to make ends meet, applying for jobs and being turned down at every turn. His flashy clothes and expensive trips were a thing of the past, replaced by a desperate scramble to stay afloat. Part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, seeing him face the consequences of his actions. But another part of me felt nothing. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with them. Through it all, I found support in unexpected places. Cousins I hadn't been close to reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing stories about how they'd also felt overlooked or dismissed by my parents. Friends rallied around me, inviting me into their families for holidays and reminding me that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. The restitution payments from my parents and Eric provided a financial cushion I hadn't expected, allowing me to rebuild and move forward. It wasn't about the money. It was about knowing they couldn't walk away from this unscathed. At work, things were better than ever. Michelle and the leadership team recognized my resilience throughout the ordeal and offered me a promotion, a leadership role that cemented my position at the company. It was a moment of validation, proof that no matter how much they tried to tear me down, I'd come out stronger. As for my parents, they tried one last time to reconcile. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen them. "We're sorry, Jason," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We just want our family back." I stared at them for a long moment before responding. "You lost your family the moment you decided to betray me," I said. "This isn't something you can fix with an apology." I shut the door, leaving them standing on the doorstep. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With my career back on track and my parents' influence firmly out of my life, I felt like I was finally free to focus on the future. I didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out. Leaving behind the wreckage of my family felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. For years, I'd carried the weight of their expectations, manipulations, and betrayals. Now, with the lawsuits concluded and the truth fully revealed, I had no intention of looking back. I moved to a new city, Boston this time. The crisp, bustling streets offered me a fresh start, far away from the whispers of my old life. The position I'd accepted at a prestigious financial firm wasn't just a job. It was a chance to redefine myself in an environment where no one knew my history. Starting over wasn't easy. Even though my reputation had been restored, the scars from the ordeal lingered. I found myself second-guessing people's intentions, wondering if there was always another betrayal hiding around the corner. But as I settled into my new life, I began to meet people who showed me that trust could be rebuilt, piece by piece. One of my first new friends was Mark, a colleague who'd recently transferred from New York. Mark had a knack for spotting when someone was struggling. Over coffee one day, he asked me why I always seemed so guarded. I hesitated before answering, unsure of how much to share. But something about his sincerity made me open up. "It's a long story," I said, staring into my cup. "Let's just say my family situation is complicated." Mark nodded without pressing further. "Well, complicated or not, you've got people here who have your back now. Just remember that." His words stuck with me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to believe that I didn't have to face everything alone. Professionally, things were better than I could have imagined. My leadership role at the new firm gave me opportunities to shine in ways I hadn't before. I spearheaded projects that earned national recognition, and within a year, I was featured in an industry publication as one of Boston's rising stars. Seeing my name in print tied to something positive felt surreal. After everything my family had done to tarnish my reputation, here I was, proving that their efforts hadn't defined me. It was more than a victory, it was a reclaiming of my identity. Back home, the fallout from my parents and Eric's actions continued to ripple through their lives. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my parents had sold their house, downsizing to a modest apartment in a less affluent area. The financial fraud charges had left them drained, both financially and socially. They're not the same, one distant cousin told me during a call. Your mom barely leaves the house anymore, and your dad's not on any of his old committees. It's like they've disappeared. I felt no joy in hearing about their downfall, only a cold detachment. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Eric, too, was struggling. His reputation was in shambles, and his name had become a warning in professional circles. He'd burned through whatever savings he had left and was reportedly living paycheck to paycheck. The last I heard, he'd taken a job at a small company outside of Philadelphia, far from the industry he'd once dreamed of dominating. Despite their hardships, my parents and Eric continued to reach out to me. Letters and emails came sporadically, each one laced with apologies that felt more self-serving than sincere. "We miss you," one letter from my mom read. "We made mistakes, but families forgive each other. It's time to put this behind us." I never responded. There was no putting this behind us. What they had done wasn't a simple mistake. It was a deliberate betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. Forgiving them would have meant erasing the pain they caused, and I wasn't willing to do that. In the meantime, my own life continued to blossom. I joined local organizations and started volunteering at a mentorship program for young professionals. Giving back to others reminded me of why I'd worked so hard in the first place, not just to succeed, but to create opportunities for those who came after me. One of the most profound moments came during a panel discussion at an industry conference. I'd been invited to speak about resilience in the face of adversity. As I stood on the stage, looking out at the audience, I shared parts of my story, not the sordid family drama, but the lessons I'd learned about perseverance and integrity. Afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your story really resonated with me," she said. "I've been going through something similar with my family, and hearing you talk about setting boundaries made me realize it's okay to put myself first." Her words brought a lump to my throat. If sharing my experiences could help someone else find their strength, then maybe all the pain I'd endured hadn't been for nothing. The restitution payments from Eric and my parents eventually stopped coming, not because I forgave the debt, but because they simply couldn't pay anymore. My lawyer advised me to pursue further legal action, but I declined. I didn't need their money. I was already rebuilding my life on my own terms. As time went on, I found peace in the distance I'd created from my family. My new circle of friends became my chosen family, people who lifted me up instead of tearing me down. Holidays were spent with them, sharing laughter and warmth that had always been absent from my childhood. One day, as I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I came across an old photo album my mom had given me years ago. Flipping through the pages, I saw images of a younger me, smiling next to Eric at birthdays and vacations. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of myself who hadn't yet learned what family could mean. I closed the album and placed it back in the box. Those moments were part of my history, but they didn't define my future. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place when a distant relative sent me a letter. She'd read about my story in the news and wanted to share her own experiences with toxic family dynamics. "I felt so trapped for years," she wrote, "but seeing how you stood up for yourself has given me the courage to do the same. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start over." Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that the pain and betrayal I'd endured weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning of something new. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come. The family that once tried to tear me down is no longer a part of my life, but in their absence, I've built something stronger. My career, my friendships, my sense of self. All of it has flourished in ways I never thought possible. This chapter of my life is closed, and while it wasn't the story I would have chosen, it's one I've come to own. I'm no longer the outsider in my own family. I've created a new family, one built on trust, respect, and love. And for the first time, I feel truly free.